And so what we're going to talk about in this last bit is labor unions and how labor unions are going to help American workers. All right. So you can see these guys marching for some reason back in the day. And there will be a number of strikes. There will be a number of marches. There will be laws passed. It's all part of the process that labor unions are going to bring down. So one of the first ones, not the first one, but one of the first good ones that actually is effective is called the American Federation of Labor. And it is led by a guy named Samuel Gompers. Got a picture of him here. Samuel Gompers. Do notice, right? Everybody, almost everybody anyway, seems to have pretty good facial hair back in this day. So it's very popular here. So the American Federation of Labor is a union that is built for skilled workers or skilled laborers. We're going to talk more about that in a minute. But the idea here is there are certain jobs that require a certain skill set, and then there are jobs that don't. Those are called unskilled laborers or unskilled jobs. And what they figured out was that unions only work if skilled laborers are involved. Think about it like this. McDonald's. There's no shame in working for McDonald's, but the reality is anyone can work at McDonald's, right? You hire someone to cook French fries and make hamburgers, and pretty much anybody can do that. Anybody can be a checkout person at a grocery store. Anybody can be a janitor, something like that, right? And then there are jobs that take specific skill sets, like today an auto mechanic, a plumber, an electrician. These are called skilled labor jobs. Then there are jobs that require some level of college, teachers, doctors, lawyers, things like that. Those are also kind of professional labor, right? And though those are different things, but they're all work. And there's no shame in any of those jobs. But each one requires a different set of skills or a different type of education. And what they figured out was that you couldn't unionize non-skilled workers because there's too many of them. And if they go on strike, they just fire them and they hire a bunch of new ones. So if you got a bunch of dock workers, or you got a bunch of factory workers who their job is to pull this lever on this machine or run this part through this machine that really anybody could do, they don't have any power. So imagine today if all the McDonald's people go on strike, might be a bummer. You might not get French fries today, but I bet you will tomorrow. But if all your plumbers go on strike, that's going to be bad. It's going to add up. It's going to pile up, and we're going to be in trouble before too long because you can't just pick up plumbing in half an hour. You take special skills, special knowledge. And so what they figured out was labor unions only work if you have skilled laborers. Earlier versions of these unions tried to unionize everybody, and there's a sort of an element of communism in that, and that never works. Of course, the AFL, as was the case of pretty much every union or every group, did not recruit women or African Americans or any other minority group. Again, racism in this country is still, sadly, alive and well post-Civil War. We set slaves free. There is no more slavery, but we have not really dealt with the issue of racism yet. And sexism is another issue, of course, that's on the map here. And so women, Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, of course, Native Americans, Chinese Americans certainly are all being excluded from these kind of things. And these labor unions are going to focus mainly on wages, hours, and working conditions. And what Gompers does, and Gompers is kind of the one that brings this to light and figures this out, is he needs to make sure that that they have the money to do what they need to do. So as the labor unions trying to get better hours, better pay, and better working conditions, that's why you would go on strike. And that's why it only works if you're a skilled laborer. So if all the pipe fitters, all the mechanics go on strike, that's a problem. We can't have that. So we're more willing to negotiate with you. But again, all the regular workers, if they go on strike, we'll just hire more. There's always more. Labor is a supply and demand issue. And if there's a lot of it available, wages are low. That's why skilled laborers make more money. That's why plumbers, electricians, and auto mechanics make more money than people that work at McDonald's. So as Gompers is running this American Federation of Labor, he wants the people to do really two things. One, they've got to contribute money to a war chest so that when they go on strike, the people who go on strike can still get paid something, right? Because if you go on strike, they're not going to pay you. And that prevents a lot of people from going on strike. So if there's a war chest and you need to go on strike, then they've collected all this money and they give you some of it back while you're on strike, so at least you can put food on the table. Because I don't know about you, it'd be really difficult to make that choice to put food on the table or not put food on the table, but maybe, get some better working conditions. That would be tough. And a lot of people would struggle with that. The other thing he wants them to do is vote. So if all of the people in the labor union vote for particular politicians who support these labor initiatives, they can get laws passed that are not just going to help the labor union workers, but all workers. For example, today in 2020, there are laws on the books about wages, minimum wages, 40-hour work weeks, and working conditions. That's what OSHA does. All of those things are mandated by the federal government. Every state has their version of those things as well. So the labor union got a lot of that done. Now, again, it's not a perfect system, but that's where they were. Now, let's talk about the different classifications of economics. So we have upper class, middle class, and working class. You can't say lower class because that doesn't sound good. So it's upper class, middle class, and working class. And these dots aren't probably totally to scale, but they give you an idea. Most of America is middle class. Now, there's a range. You could be in lower middle class or upper middle class or mid-middle class, of course, right? And, of course, working class are the people below that. And there's not a lot of difference if you're in the upper part of the working class and the very lower part of the middle class, right? There's not a lot of difference. But there are a few things that kind of differentiate between the two. Number one, in upper class, money's not an option, not an issue. You don't worry about it. So Rockefeller is at the very top of that list, but Carnegie, Vanderbilt, Ford, all of those guys are up there. People that are in middle class, though, work. Now, most of the upper class people work too, but they work because they want to. They work because they enjoy it. They work to make more money, but they don't really need it, right? Middle class people work. Now, Dr. Walls, the neurosurgeon, I'm probably in upper middle class. I probably make, $1 million, $2 million a year. That's a lot of money. But I still have to do brain surgery in order to keep making that money. All right. I could be lawyer, Dr. Walls, the lawyer. I could be, Professor Walls. I could be the engineer. There's a lot of things in here, right? School teacher. Of course, the whole exception to this is if you're a junior college professor, they don't pay you that well. But there are other perks, trust me. In any case, middle class people do work. They still have to work to live, but they're characterized by having more than they need. You can think about it practically. A working class person rarely has enough to meet all their needs. They're going to be wondering, where am I getting my next pair of shoes? Am I going to have a coat for the upcoming winter? Is my coat going to last? Are my shoes going to last? Am I going to have enough food to put on the table day to day to day? Most of us Americans, we don't have any of those worries. So most of us are middle class. Middle class people also have more time. They have more money. And so they're able to do things differently, right? They're able to take vacation. They're able to have better medical care. They're able to go to the park. They're able to go to the amusement parks. They're able to go to those sporting events that we talked about earlier that electricity is now allowing them to go to. They're able to buy a home out in the country, that kind of thing. And so the middle class has that characteristic. America has always had a big middle class. That's part of what our freedoms allow for. Of course, the other side of that is you can fail, but you can also get very rich, like Rockefeller and Carnegie. These guys were poor when they were kids. Rockefeller's father was a con man. They were broke all the time. Carnegie was an orphan who kind of got adopted by a wealthier guy. A lot of these people were just regular people who got in at the right time, right idea, and worked very, very hard. And you can see professionals will be at the top end of this, and skilled laborers like plumbers and electricians and so on might be toward the lower end of this, although some of them can make a ton of money, especially when you need your drains unclogged. I mean, what are you going to do? Then you got working class. Again, you don't say lower class, you say working class. That's the unskilled laborers. That's the general factory workers. That includes also farmers, farm hands, people that just plant and pick, that kind of thing. Pretty much anybody can do those kinds of jobs. Those jobs do not pay well because the labor supply is very large. And again, supply and demand says that means things are going to be reduced. Wages are going to be reduced. This is the trouble with minimum wage. Calculating it, defining that, what jobs are worth it. Some are not. That's just the reality. These people rarely have enough to meet their needs. We would call them poor, probably. Some, again, being very poor. The problem they have is, yes, they don't have the skills. Yes, they don't have the education. The problem is they don't have the opportunity to obtain those skills or those educations, because they're working all the time. They spend all their time. Again, a typical work week in the early days is 12, 13 hours a day, 6 days a week. That's why labor unions want better working hours and so on. And they want better pay. So if you're working that much, you don't have the time to go get educated, to go learn a trade, to go learn a skill. And so from that standpoint, it's very hard to move up. It's possible, but it's difficult. There's also lack of opportunity because of the racial issue, racism and discrimination, which is alive and well. In 1896, discrimination will be made common by the Supreme Court when they rule on this issue called Plessy versus Ferguson and others that says separate but equal is okay. And that will create basically system-wide segregation. And so if you're black or Chinese or any of these others, you're not going to have the opportunities. If you're a woman, you're not going to have the opportunities to gain these skills. It's very difficult. And so this group of people are who the labor unions really don't help and can't help until they get laws passed. Again, that was the genius of Samuel Gompers, to get those labor unions voting so that they could get people in office who would create laws that would help them. And they have, as we've said. So labor unions aren't going to be about helping directly the working class. Therefore, middle class skilled laborers pretty much only. All right. The last thing we're going to talk about is competition and monopoly. So you've all played Monopoly, I'm sure. The idea, of course, is to own as much property as you can so that you make everyone else go bankrupt. That's exactly what these guys are doing. Rockefeller wants to own all the oil production. Carnegie wants all the steel production, and so on. And they get close in some cases. And at this point in time, we don't really have any rules or laws governing businesses that are that large, because we've never really had businesses that are that large. It's never really been a huge issue. And so we have to deal with that. Somehow the government's going to have to step in with that. There are also, of course, no laws governing how workers are treated. Again, labor unions are going to take care of a lot of that. And so what happens is these big businesses can and do take advantage of the workers. They take advantage of the public sometimes. A lot of what they do is not illegal. It's just problematic. So eventually the government will come down and they will pass laws. So here's how the government, every government functions. They're reactive rather than proactive, right? The government can't really foresee problems. They can only react to problems that happen. And then they pass laws to deal with or mitigate those problems, right? And that's what these are. So the federal government, the local state governments have never made laws dealing with these huge businesses because they've never been an issue, but now they are, and they're becoming an issue. And so, for example, in 1887, Congress will pass something called the Interstate Commerce Commission Act, and it'll create this entity called the Interstate Commerce Commission, or the ICC. You know how the government likes its alphabet. And its job is to regulate railroads. Railroads are the first big monopoly in this country. And they controlled everything in that region. And there's all sorts of things like rebates where they would give their good customers money or they would charge them less, and then drawbacks where they would charge their smaller or bad the word just escaped me. They would charge their the people that were using their services who didn't provide a lot of money, they would charge them more. And those are illegal now because of laws that are passed, like the Interstate Commerce Commission and later the Sherman Antitrust Act. So the Interstate Commerce Commission is formed to police all of these railroads. For example, they'll say you can't change your rates without some number of weeks' notice, and you can't charge different rates for different people without having very specific reasons and only under certain conditions. And so now all the railroad companies have to comply with those rules. Well, you know what that means, right? The government, the ICC, is an entity that's created by Congress. They now are under the control of the President of the United States, the executive office. They have to hire people. They have to build offices. They have to hire agents to go out and track everything. They have to put out literature. They got to hire secretaries and coffee makers and do everything. And that costs money. And who's paying for that? You, right? So when they pass a law like the Interstate Commerce Commission, which they needed to do, it is going to increase taxes. So when the government passes a law, they always increase taxes. Now, the next one that comes out is the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. This is an antitrust law or an anti-monopoly law. And without going into all the details of it, it essentially says you can't create a situation by one company or multiple companies where you're hindering competition. You and I, the consumer, we want competition. Competition does several things. It gets prices down, it gets the availability of products up usually, and the quality of the products goes up. It also forces companies to innovate, to create better products. A great example of that is Henry Ford. He came out and he built this car. I think it was the Model A, and he built this car, and he built the same car for like 20 years. You could get it in the truck, the two-door, the four-door version. But there weren't really any other options. No one else was really building cars like that. Cars were basically hand-built, sort of like airplanes, and they were, you had to be wealthy to own one until Ford came along. But he built the same car with the same options basically for 20 years because he had no competition. Once other companies like Dodge, General Motors, and others came online and started competing, well, then they all had to start building better cars. And that is good for us because then we have better products. So that's why you want competition. So the Sherman Antitrust Act is passed to try to prevent situations where people were breaking the rules. And here's how, basically it works. Let's say these businesses are doing A, B, and C, these three things, A, B, and C, and those are hindering competition. So the government will pass a law that says, okay, A, B, and C are now illegal. Can't do it anymore. And so the smart lawyers and the smart accountants and whatever who work for Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, those guys will go, okay, we can't do A, B, and C, but what about D, E, and F? We'll do those three things instead, and it'll be similar. And then eventually the government will say D, E, and F are now illegal too. So this is the constant game that gets played. The laws get bigger, takes more to enforce. The companies are going to keep trying to do what they can because their purpose is to make profit. This is not a bad thing. This is just how life works. So we need competition. We don't need monopolies. But like I said at the beginning, we really did need these monopolies at the beginning to create these big, huge businesses, to create these huge industries, because they set us up for oil, steel, and all sorts of other things. And in the 20th century, we've got to go to war twice in the early half, and those are huge wars that we have to win, and we do. And I don't think we do it, at least not as soon, if we don't have those guys building those big companies. So they are very important. Again, they're not perfect. No one is. So the next lecture, we're going to talk about the lackluster presidents of the United States. If you can see and make out this screen, it's a lot of the guys on the bottom row that are in that category of lackluster president. So we're going to start there in the next lecture. Hope you're all doing well. Be sure to be checking out the syllabus, the course schedule, and make sure you're on track. And if you have questions about anything, please send me an email, and all that information is in your Blackboard. Have a good one.